Good morning. I'm Shihoko Goto, Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise. I'm also the Deputy Director of the Asia Program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for joining us today. The leaders of the G7 will be meeting later this week in Hiroshima, hometown of the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and one of the two cities in the world to date that has faced nuclear attack, the other being Nagasaki. The summit meeting comes at a time when tensions worldwide are on the rise, and the risk of nuclear attack in particular seems to be growing. As the host nation, Japan sees this summit being held at a critical juncture in ensuring stability worldwide. There will be a call for the G7 to uphold the international order based on the rule of law, and also to advance the continued growth in the international economy. It should be noted that Japan still remains the only Asian member country amongst the G7, and it has traditionally taken a position of bridging, acting as a bridge between East and West. Now, though, it is increasingly seeing itself as a bridge builder in bringing together advanced and emerging economies. So reaching out to the global South and having a greater diversity in views will be high on this agenda at this latest Hiroshima summit. And indeed, the Hiroshima meeting will not just be a gathering of G7 leaders, in addition to the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Council. It would also bring together leaders of Australia, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam, as well as Comoros as the African Union chair and Cook Islands as the Pacific Islands Forum chair. So what can we expect from the latest G7 meeting? What's at stake? I'm thrilled to be joined by some of the Wilson Center's top analysts on countries that make up the G7 and the issues that they will be discussing. First up, I will be asking Robin Quinville to speak. She is the director of the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center and is a seasoned career diplomat who has been the chargé d'affaires at the US Embassy in Berlin. Also joining us is William Drosiak, a global fellow and former foreign editor of the Washington Post. Philip Rieker, chair of the Global Europe program and former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. We also have Rob Litvak, Senior Vice President and Director of International Studies at the Center. And finally, Robert Daly, Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. So with that, Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shihoko, and I'm delighted to be able to join this discussion. So to look ahead, I'm first going to take a look back, okay, at where we were a year ago. Germany was actually hosting the G7 summit at that time, and the host was Olaf Scholz, their new chancellor, hadn't been in office for very many months, but had already shaken up the German approach to foreign and security policy by recognizing that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were at a watershed moment. And the terminology that he used for that reversed the decades, really, of underinvestment in Germany's foreign and security policy, particularly when it came to defense capabilities and so forth. And so strong support for Ukraine there. You know, he was the new leader last year, but this year we're going to have a couple of new leaders as well, because there is a new leader in Britain since that time. It's now Rishi Sunak, and of course in Italy there's also a new prime minister. So looking at that, what did they focus on last year in that moment of crisis, just 3.5 months after the invasion of Ukraine? Their themes then will influence the themes now. So it was post-pandemic, and I think had there not been the invasion of Ukraine, they probably would have had much more in the communique on that. It was feeling the cost of investments and solutions, but also noting the gaps in diplomacy, particularly when vaccine diplomacy when it came to the global South. Climate concerns running strongly throughout their discussions. But much of their discussion focused on the consequences of Ukraine. So expressing support for the rules-based order, making sure that they focused on assistance to Ukraine and the debates over that, focusing on energy supplies for Europe in the future, and as they looked to decouple their dependence on Russian sources. There were real concerns. Would Europe freeze? What would happen for the rest of the world? Would LNG be able to suffice to tide them over during that winter? And yet there was a determination to phase out that dependency on Russian energy. And then there was also a strong concern about food security, given Ukraine and Russia's roles as providers of grain for the rest of the world. Finally, there was focus on the continuing supply chain disruptions. Germany followed that meeting up with some follow-up work. They held a meeting in Berlin to focus on assistance to Ukraine reconstruction. They held that in October. And then at the foreign ministers meeting last year, they re-emphasized their determination to stand with Ukraine, again, with the focus on energy, food security, and economic security. And I think that economic security is really a theme running throughout, that for all of the participants, it showed just how important that was. So as we approach this summit, I'd just like to remind everybody that Ukrainian President Zelensky has been in Europe over the last few days, and I don't think that that is any coincidence. He's in London today, meeting with Rishi Sunak. He was in Germany over the weekend, where Germany announced a new package of aid for Ukraine that is nearly $3 billion. And really that is raising the level of German engagement, including on the military front, with Ukraine. And he also made lightning visits to both Rome and to Paris, which I know my colleagues are going to talk about. So as the G7 leaders come to Hiroshima to kind of review progress and and look ahead and shape the discussions of the future, I'm going to make a couple of wild predictions that my colleagues might actually take me to task on. So here we go. The focus on climate will remain strong. This is something where they feel that they must show leadership on that front. So they'll probably look back also to COP27 and see what they can do to reinforce the goals from there. I predict there'll be less focus on COVID, but more focus on pandemic prevention in the future, because this is an issue that while the COVID itself has receded, the issues it raised have not gone away. I think there'll be some satisfaction as they assess progress to their goal of phasing out dependency on Russian energy sources. And Phil can talk a little more about this, but really the European Union countries did a lot to raise their renewable energy targets. They made significant reductions in energy imports from Russia. They have raised the amount of LNG that they are bringing in. And the G7 itself set a price cap that has affected the price of Russian oil worldwide. I would expect them to pay some attention to crises elsewhere, because that is what they do. So you'll see some focus on difficulties in countries in Africa, which are also a potential source of migration to Europe. There'll be focus on the situation in Sudan. But most important, and I think a real focus of this discussion, will be China, because we have seen with visits to China over the past few weeks where there are both concerns and where there can be differences among members of the G7. I think that the focus on de-risking rather than decoupling will be an important one, and I'd expect to hear more about that from this meeting. But I think that a discussion of China and its intentions will definitely be front and center. So with all of these predictions that many of my colleagues may disagree with, I'm going to turn it back to you, because I know that I'm also interested in hearing what my colleagues have to say about the particular country's approach to this. So back to you, Shihoko.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you for laying out what to expect on the broader agenda. So let me now turn to Bill. you have written an authoritative biography of Emmanuel Macron. What can we expect from France? How are France's interests going to be reflected at the upcoming meeting? You're on mute.
I think the focus will be on two subjects. One is the arms deliveries, accelerated arms deliveries by the Europeans, notably France, to Ukraine, and also the question of economic coercion with China. First, on Ukraine, Emmanuel Macron received President Zelensky last evening. They had a 3-hour dinner at the Élysée. He will elaborate further tonight in an interview on French television, but it's going to involve a dramatic increase in France's assistance in providing tanks, light armor, and also training for battalions of Ukrainian soldiers in France on how to use these weapons. And as Robin pointed out, the timing is no coincidence. First, ahead of the G7 summit, but also ahead of the expected counteroffensive that Ukraine has been waiting to launch, and I think in expectation that more arms deliveries will come. So if these can be accelerated, it'll be a significant factor. And I think that's where the Europeans are very much in sync with the United States, the Biden administration, in terms of doing what they can to prepare and help Ukraine in advance of this expected counteroffensive. I think the question of the other countries that have been invited to this, notably India, how they react to this and whether there will be some kind of tacit show of support from them will be also significant, because the big problem with the global South, generically speaking, has been that a lot of these countries remain on the fence and have not engaged in the sanctions that the United States and its European allies have imposed. On China, that's also going to be a very ticklish subject. The EU foreign ministers met over the weekend, trying to coordinate their positions on how far to go in terms of enforcing a tougher stand against China. I think there's been quite a lot of controversy about Emmanuel Macron's visit to China. When he returned on the plane, he gave an interview talking about we need to be concerned, we Europeans need to be concerned about becoming vassals to American foreign policy. And this was a warning similar to what France and Germany launched ahead of the Iraq War 20 years ago, in which they refused to participate. They said this could end badly, and in fact it did. In this case, the warning by Macron was that Europe could find itself dragged into a potential conflict with China over Taiwan that they did not necessarily want to have happen. And I think there it's interesting how the Biden administration, in the wake of that controversy over Macron's visit to China, has pulled back its language, no longer talking about decoupling, which made Europeans nervous. And now they use the similar language of de-risking the relationship with China. So there are signs that the US and its European allies are trying to coordinate this. I might add that I've, in talking with French diplomats and in the 6 hours or so of conversation I had with Macron, it's interesting to see his attitude toward diplomacy is much different than traditional diplomats. He says, I want to be provocative in order to move these multilateral, multinational institutions forward. And you may recall his previous controversial statement about NATO being brain dead, which occurred, which was made in an interview with The Economist 2 weeks before a NATO summit in London. And at that time, there was a lot of nervousness that maybe NATO was becoming brain dead. And sure enough, it did trigger a response, and NATO came out of that much stronger and better prepared for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which of course has galvanized the alliance and given it a new lease on life. And similarly, I think he was trying to do that with his language in the wake of his China visit, warning Europeans that we could go, that Europe could be inadvertently dragged into a conflict. But I think since then there's been progress. He has tried to align himself with the other European allies, and also been gratified to see that the language from the Biden administration is now much more in sync with the European allies.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. So, Phil, Europe is heavily represented at the G7 meetings. What is the consensus? Is there a consensus in the EU as we move forward in these meetings? And also, I'm hoping you could share a little bit of your thoughts about Italy's position in particular as well.
Well, thank you, Shihoko. It's great to join you. And of course, my colleagues, Robin and Bill, always have excellent insights. Let me take that on about the EU because Ursula von der Leyen herself has spoken today already from Brussels in laying out expectations of the EU for the G7 summit in Hiroshima at the end of the week. It's a busy week for EU leadership as well. She highlighted, of course, Ukraine. That will be the main topic at Hiroshima. And she underscored the united response to the Russian invasion, a prolonged, reliable support from the EU. Many had predicted, of course, that this wouldn't last, that unity amongst the EU was not sustainable. I think first and foremost in that line of thinking was Putin himself. But Ursula von der Leyen herself was in Kyiv just last week, just prior to President Zelensky's, of course, trip that we've already heard about to key European capitals. And the EU is going to show, I think, the same level of stamina and perseverance together. And Ursula von der Leyen said today she expects all of the leaders to rally behind a couple of main principles on Ukraine. First and foremost, of course, the support for Ukraine will be for as long as it takes, as she says. And secondly, the key note, and we've heard this from President Biden and others, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. Her message was that Ukraine should set out core principles for a just peace. Of course, President Zelensky has done just that with his peace formula. I think he discussed those, I'm sure, at the highest levels in his visits in Europe, including with the Pope, whom he met with when he was in Rome. That peace formula gives a basis for which Zelensky has said he is prepared to talk and discuss. Von der Leyen, also representing all of the 27 EU members, underscored as well sanctions. There have been 11 rounds of EU sanctions, which have had an impact on Russia. I think at this summit, the G7 will focus more on enforcement and how to counter the circumvention of sanctions that are already in place. And then once they get past Ukraine, a very major focus, there will be a discussion, of course, as my colleagues have mentioned, on managing the relationship with China. Von der Leyen outlined the expectation that the G7 will converge on a set of shared principles, a multifaceted approach to China, that de-risking as the key statement, not decoupling. And that's, of course, as already noted, been joined by the United States. That engagement with China will include also the climate agenda, which remains very important, clean tech, renewables. These are all crucial elements, not only for the climate, but for our economic considerations as well. And that's probably a good moment to shift to a look at Italy and what we can expect from Italy, which is, of course, a G7 member state playing a very leading role in this. And I would note that just today in Brussels as well, the EU released growth expectations higher than expected for Italy at 1.2% for this year, which makes it the highest in the EU. And that is a credit to Italy's dynamic economy, but to the leadership of Giorgia Meloni. And I think Zelensky would have shared with Meloni, who has been a very strong, some would say impeccable supporter of Zelensky and Ukraine since Putin's invasion. The meetings in Rome were described as very good. She's carrying on, that is, Meloni is carrying on where Prime Minister Draghi left off. You'll recall Draghi accompanied other major European leaders to Kyiv in the early days of this. Meloni herself has been a strong proponent of the process, beginning the process of accession to the European Union for Kyiv. And she's considered a major proponent of that. I think Rome has also taken a lead on the discussion of reconstruction for Ukraine, economic reconstruction, physical reconstruction after the devastation that, of course, we've all seen. I think the conference that was held in Rome, a reconstruction conference, was very important. There'll be another one in June, hosted by the British in London. But that has brought thousands of big, medium, and small companies together in Rome to begin looking at how they can participate, because, of course, the private sector is going to have a huge role in this. Italy, too, has led in diversifying the energy supply for not just Italy's economic engine, but for all of Europe. They took a lead through, of course, their company, Eni, in shifting away from Russian gas supplies, and they will be completely non-dependent on Russian gas by 2024. This has been, I think, a big effort looking at other suppliers like Algeria, Azerbaijan, the Gulf countries, Angola, Mozambique, Tunisia, Libya. And of course, I think that leads to a discussion that Meloni will want to have on those countries as well, and the migration issue, which is crucial for Italy. Of course, given geography, and geography matters, they receive, the first flows of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa leaving the North African coast. And of course, Tunisia itself has been a big challenge recently. I think those will come up in some of the discussions because it has an economic element as well as a security element to it. And as they look at resilient supply chains and strategic industries and infrastructure, those will be key discussions as well. I think there'll be some discussion of the IRA, that is the Inflation Reduction Act, industrial policy from the US and the Biden administration, but the Italians, as well as the rest of the EU, have taken on board, expressing their concerns, but understanding what the Biden administration is trying to accomplish with that major legislation. And I think we can also look ahead then to Italy leading the G7 next year. It's a bit early to describe their agenda. That's a work in progress, but there will be continuity we can expect. So coming out of this summit, we can see the agenda going on, the major geopolitical dossiers of Ukraine, China. Certainly, I think Italy will continue to have the G7 take a leading role in global leadership. It's something the Biden administration has focused on. I do think as well, one last point, that the Italians will focus on outreach. The G7 is a driver of global governance, and they want to make sure, as many of us do, that it doesn't feed a narrative about the West and the rest, the sort of club of the rich idea about the G7. Italy, of course, led the G20 a couple of years ago and have experience with that broader collection. I think Italy will want to draw attention to the global South, which is on people's mind, particularly in the Mediterranean, as I mentioned, which is itself very unstable as a consequence of the Ukraine conflict. So a lot of ideas under consideration in terms of green transition, in terms of other leadership on things like food security, women's economic empowerment. These are all issues that Giorgia Meloni, frankly, has given good voice to, and I think we can expect the Italians to continue to play a role this year and the next year when they take over the presidency.
Great. I think it's worth noting that when the G5 expanded to the G7, the focus was really on economic issues, and we've seen the agenda really expand beyond economic issues into the security realm. And now we have this idea of economic security, the overlap of national security concerns with economic growth prospects. One thing I should have also mentioned at the onset was that there was a lot of concern that Biden would actually not be at the meeting this year, and that he would actually be zooming in to deal with the debt ceiling issue. But it appears that he will actually be there, much to the relief of the Japanese. So with that, let me turn now to Rob. When Japan became the G7 host nation, Kishida really wanted to have this in Hiroshima. He has a personal commitment to really deliver the message of non-proliferation. How will this be expressed at the G7 statement concluding the meetings? What kind of consensus can there be amongst the G7?
Well, the context is, as you state, Shihoko, the selection of Hiroshima is rich in historical symbolism and contemporary relevance. And I think that the agenda will be less on nuclear proliferation, that is additional, states acquiring nuclear weapons, and more on the central strategic balance itself in what is an emergent tripolar nuclear order. The G7 meeting is being held amidst the Ukraine war, which is an epochal event for Europe in the post-World War II era, and it's being conducted under a nuclear shadow. Putin is engaged in nuclear saber rattling of a kind not witnessed except during the nadir of the Cold War. And the Biden administration has said that Putin is a desperate Putin if facing a military defeat or a threat to his regime as a consequence of a loss in the Ukraine war, that under that circumstance, acting in desperation, that Putin might turn to nuclear use. So we're in what Kissinger describes as a new era. And that coincides with renewed tensions in Northeast Asia over Taiwan, China's increasingly assertive exercises around the island, naval and air exercises, which reflect its expansion of its conventional regional capabilities, and also its broader expansive maritime claims to sovereignty in adjacent waters. We're operating in a new geopolitical environment. China is emerging as a peer nuclear competitor to the United States and Russia. By the 2030s, China is expected to have equivalent sized strategic nuclear forces to those of the other two powers. So we are on the cusp of a transition from the Cold War and post-Cold War eras bipolar nuclear system to a tripolar one. And in tandem with that development, China and Russia are developing a pragmatic, quasi-alliance constituting an authoritarian bloc, which obviously, stands in opposition or juxtaposition to the group of democratic industrial states that are assembled in Hiroshima. And within this context, there's also unconstrained competition among the three powers as the arms control architecture is being dismantled to the point of near collapse. Now, within this geostrategic context, two traditional dangers of the Cold War are being recast. The first is a recasting of what analysts call the stability-instability paradox of the Cold War, which is that if you had a stable strategic nuclear balance, that it would deflect competition to peripheral areas like Vietnam or Afghanistan. In the contemporary era, though, Ukraine and Taiwan are not peripheral. I mean, they're central and they're vital interests to the powers engaged. So that's one critical way in which a Cold War risk has been recast. A second is that the stability and stability paradox posits that you have a stable central strategic relationship that then deflects conflict to peripheral areas. Well, in the contemporary era, the central strategic balance, the so-called balance of terror, is, in the words of a Rand analyst from the Cold War, becoming more delicate. And that's a combination of unconstrained competition and the extension of competition into new domains of cyberspace and outer space. So if a conflict were to develop or a crisis were to deteriorate, the first move in a confrontation among the great powers would be in one of the new domains of cyberspace or outer space, rather than as was conceived during the Cold War, where you'd have a conventional conflict in Europe that would then escalate to the nuclear era. The term strategic stability has encompassed two dimensions. First is arms race stability, and the other is crisis stability. And where we're at now, and I don't think, I mean, it sets the context of the G7. I don't think they have a solution to this problem, but that strategic stability is being eroded, that in an era of unconstrained competition, with the demise of our arms control architecture, China outside that architecture, we are on the cusp of arms race instability, and arms race instability is exacerbating crisis, is generating crisis instability in these key theaters, Ukraine and Taiwan. So within this context, where the Cold War dangers are being recast in the new geostrategic environment, there are policy tensions that arise from that, and they can't be resolved, but they can be managed, and in pursuit of strategic stability at a time when relations are toxic and communication at the highest level has all but collapsed. Let me mention four elements of what that might entail. The first would be reinforcing comprehensive deterrence. The Ukraine commitment is obviously key. Russia has been engaging in nuclear saber rattling. The Biden administration has said that any nuclear use would be crossing that threshold, that they're not, as the National Security Advisor put it, going to slice the salami, that a low yield use would be viewed differently than a high yield use of a nuclear weapon. And there's need to bolster both the conventional and nuclear balances in Europe and Northeast Asia to deter adventurism or aggression by the great power competitors. Second, maintain the residual arms control architecture such as it is. Here, the New START Treaty expires in 2026. We should try to maintain those constraints on offensive forces. Third, do what can be done to mitigate the risks of unconstrained competition, such as blurring the distinction between conventional and nuclear operations. I'm thinking, for example, of testing hypersonic weapons in both conventional and potentially nuclear modes. And finally, maintaining diplomatic and military communication lines to avoid miscommunication and inadvertent escalation. Is that a compelling agenda that will solve the problems? No, but I think it's what we can aspirationally attempt, essentially making the best of a bad situation. Back to you, Shoko.
Right. So we've already had a lot on the agenda. We've discussed a number of critical issues, not least Ukraine, nuclear security, and of course, we've talked a great deal about China. All roads lead to China, and yet China is not part of the discussion. So let me turn over to Robert to have a greater understanding of how Beijing sees this, and what kind of action statement can we expect from China in the, not just the near term, but in the longer term as well?
Well, thank you, Shihoko. The China context of the G7 meeting, as all of my colleagues have said, is very important. But it is only one of the important contexts. And I find increasingly in a lot of Washington discussions, as soon as we turn to China, it seems to suck all of the oxygen out of the room for all of the other issues. So I don't want to give the impression in ending on China that the Ukraine context, the global warming context, economic context are not also extremely important. But I do want to give our viewers a sense of what I'll be looking for and what I think the Chinese government will be looking for within the China context at the G7. And I think that the big question is going to be, how do the leaders of the developed democracies manage the confluence of two concurrent and somewhat contradictory strategic impulses within their own ranks? And these are emerging just at the time of the G7. On the one hand, what Biden has called extreme competition has increased skepticism about Chinese power among all of the members of the G7. And this suspicion about what China intends and its ability to carry it out, I think has been brought about in the United States, but in the other countries as well, primarily by China's own actions under Xi Jinping. In the United States, it was China's build out and militarization of islands in the South China Sea in 2016, and its subsequent ignoring of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's findings that none of China's territorial claims in the region had any validity. I think it was that incident more than any other one. There were a whole series of things that changed American views. Within Europe, it has primarily been about China's economic coercion of members of the EU. Most recently, Lithuania, but a number of other countries have all felt the lash. So there is as a result, there has been a growing alignment over the past several years of views between Northeast Asian partners, Japan, the EU partners, and the United States, concern about Chinese power. That alignment is far from absolute, but it's been increasing, and we've seen a number of signs of that. In mid-April, it's already been mentioned that Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech in which she said, a very strong statement for the European Parliament. She said, in the last decade, China has become an economic powerhouse and a key global player. It is now reducing its dependency on the world while increasing the world's dependency on itself. She has been highlighting the fact that the European Union sees China as a strategic rival. 2 days later, Prime Minister Kishida, and he's been making a series of statements about China, has said Japan will keep calling for China to act responsibly on the world stage. That is what he is bringing into the Hiroshima meetings. On May 9th, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz uncharacteristically urged the European Union to reduce its reliance on China. And he accused Beijing of increasingly acting as a rival and a competitor rather than a partner. The fact that Scholz has moved that far is perhaps the most important bellwether, but he's not the only one. On the same day, Meloni in Italy signaled to the United States that Italy, the only country that had endorsed China's Belt and Road Initiative, might pull out. This is not yet a done deal, but there's extreme skepticism in Italy about the value of working with China on initiatives like the BRI. The UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, said that the G7 countries must stand together to prevent economic coercion from China. So all of them are ringing the alarm bells. And this was also seen at the G7 finance ministers meeting in early May. And many of their public statement focused on China as well. So the European focus is about coercion, but it's not just about coercion. As Rob mentioned, the security lens is very important. The broad context, over the past few years, we have seen NATO for the first time begin to define a China-facing mission. Japan has begun to increase its own defense budget, a very difficult move for Japan, and has said that an invasion of Taiwan by China would also invoke Japan's interests. So we see this growing skepticism. There is an expectation that the G7 joint leaders communique will call on China to act responsibly, and China will see that as a direct attack. That's one of our strategic impulses. On the other side, and this gets to what Bill very correctly highlighted, there are increasing signs of interest in a sort of a détente with China, in a cooling down the rhetoric and of slowing this constant drumbeat of hostility. Now, this détente, if that's a correct word for it, we don't really know yet. This is what I'll be watching for at the G7. Would be occurring very much in something like a Cold War context. None of the G7 members' accusations or concerns about China have been rolled back at all. But there's another stream. And it begins, I think, with von der Leyen's statement that she wants, and Bill touched on this, not decoupling from China, but de-risking. And that language has been picked up on quite clearly by the United States, a tamping down in rhetoric. What does that mean? Does de-risking really a hard-nosed look at our strategic interests vis-a-vis China? Is it an attempt to use a scalpel to carve out the issues in which we are overexposed to China? Or is it sort of a linguistic way of wanting to wish away the difficulties with China and proceed under the old dispensation? We don't really know the answer to that yet, but this de-risking language has been adopted by most of the G7 countries. In the United States, just in the past few weeks, we see a new openness signaled by Secretary of State Blinken to China's involvement in any kind of peace process that may emerge in Ukraine. We hear from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and others in the administration, a desire to, as they say, get back to Bali, to try to go back to the meeting in Bali last fall between Xi Jinping and Biden, which wanted, again, to tone down rhetoric and get this relationship on a sustainable track. There's a desire then to move beyond the spy balloon incident. This is a little bit tricky because the US government has not yet made public the results of its investigation into what the spy balloon's capabilities and actions were. I don't think that Congress is going to let the administration pretend that didn't happen and move beyond it. But we know that if those results are made public, China is going to position itself, implausibly from the American point of view, as the aggrieved party. They're the ones who are hurt by the spy balloon incident. How will that be handled? Still, there's this back to Bali spirit now. The US and China have just agreed on the need to stabilize the relationship. It's interesting that China accepted this language of stabilization when over the past year they've rejected the United States calls for guardrails in the relationship. They seem to mean exactly the same thing, but this is language now that China can accept. And then lastly, there's a growing understanding within the G7 that while China's power is in many ways a threat to the G7 members, it's also understood that other nations in the global south especially, and countries like India and Indonesia and Brazil that will be present, don't share all of NATO's views of the war in Ukraine or even of the global order. They're more receptive to some Chinese and Russian messages, and therefore we might need to balance them. And that's the question then. How do we balance at the G7 all of these concerns, which are extremely serious for all the countries involved, with this desire to manage well or stabilize China's rise, China's power, and achieve some kind of détente, especially within the global order context? Can we find language that warns about China in the right way that doesn't alienate partners outside of the G7? That's what we should be watching for, what I think China will be watching for. China's response, lastly, they will make broad statements rejecting any criticisms, and they will engage in intense bilateral diplomacy after the G7 meeting with all of those involved. They will lay the blame for any broad suspicion of China at the doorstep of the United States, and they'll continue to look for ways to drive wedges, particularly between Europe and the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. We have a lot of questions actually coming in, but sort of building on where Robert left off, I'd like to take Leon Pennenberg's question. He was the Secretariat of the European Parliament and asked, the G7 has less economic power than before, and what will this G7 summit meeting offer to the global south to ensure that countries turn to them and the advanced economies rather than turning to Russia and China? And somewhat related to that, this is more of a technology issue. The White House correspondent of the Voice of America, Paris Huang, asks, can the G7 actually be able to reach an agreement of limiting export of sensitive semiconductor technology to China? So essentially, the question is this. to what extent can there be a consensus about providing an alternative vision for global growth that China in particular has been investing in? It has been giving a great deal of financial assistance and the like to the global South. Can the G7 come up to have an alternative roadmap to that? And then related to that, the technology issue. We've had Japan and the Netherlands and the United States come to an agreement about export control on chip manufacturing technology. Is there a consensus about keeping advanced technology more broadly from the hands of China? I'm going to turn first to Bill, because you mentioned economic coercion at the beginning.
Yes, very good point. I think the thing to watch are not just the nice words and coordination of statements, but also the follow through in terms of actions. Rob mentioned Chancellor Scholz's strong message about not giving in to Chinese coercion. Yet, practically at the same time, the port of Hamburg announced that it was selling off many of its port facilities to China. And similarly, we'll still be watching, as Phil I know can expound on this, whether Italy follows up on its promise to pull out of the Belt and Road Initiative, which it said it would do by the end of this year. So, and then finally, the point you raised about advanced technologies and semiconductors. Europeans are very nervous about the extent to which the United States seems to want to go in terms of preventing China from acquiring advanced technologies. And I think they are fearful that this could impinge on their own trade, their lucrative trade with China in such a way that it would penalize its populations and their economies in a very severe manner.
Phil and Robin, there's been a lot of talk about a division within Europe that the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is creating. I'm hoping either one of you could address some of that from Germany's perspective or indeed Italy's perspective.
Why don't I jump in and say, as we heard, and as you've heard directly from sources in Rome, Italy is looking for a way to leave the Belt and Road. It hasn't delivered for Italy. That was clear during Prime Minister Draghi's time, and Prime Minister Meloni has continued to see that. Well, we have this surprising, beyond expectations, economic growth predicted now for Italy. It is not the BRI that's contributing to that. At the same time, I think the Italians want to walk this carefully. I think Meloni wants to also go to China and be able to discuss the broader relationship there. And at Hiroshima and as the G7, there's again this desire to have a united, positive, confident message coming out of the summit, avoiding giving the impression on one hand that there's any retreat from international commitments. On the other hand, focusing on the economic security discussion that I think Japan, in its leadership of the G7 this year, has been pushing, this whole concept of de-risking as opposed to decoupling, where there is alignment between North America and Europe and the Japanese on this. I think Europe and the UK, for that matter, Robin may want to add on this, will want to make clear that this isn't targeted only at China, shouldn't be defensive in the sense of some sort of fortress G7. And again, the global South is very much in people's minds. There's a separate agenda point on the global South. Overall message, again, I think on China from the summit will be concerns about economic behavior. How do we discuss those? How do we get back into dialogue? And we've heard from colleagues the efforts in Washington as well as other capitals to move in that direction. A willingness to cooperate with China on global challenges, even as Secretary Blinken underscored, if China can be constructive and play a role on helping to forge a peace in the Ukraine conflict, using their influence on Vladimir Putin, who is responsible for this war, why wouldn't we look at that? And we'll see where that goes. Clean energy economy, that's going to be key. All of these things, I think, are things that are being worked well transatlantically, and again, showcasing the G7 as really the foremost platform for what President Biden talked about as this focus on alliances and partnerships in global leadership. Robin?
Yeah, I'll just add to that, Phil, that I think that there's a couple of things going on for Germany, which has, of course, very much a highly manufacturing-led and export-led economy. And that's what I actually think is the genius of the term de-risking, because it also is something where you are saying not just governments have a responsibility to assess this, but also companies have a need to assess what they are doing. And you have some very big German companies that are very big players in China. It's also worth remembering that many countries in Europe are only now, or in the last few years, grappling with the concepts that we have had here, and that is a CFIUS-like process regarding investment. And so this is something that is, I think, a work in progress and something they still grapple with. And you see that, Robert, when it comes to decisions like the Port of Hamburg, for example. So and to the question that our colleague from the European Parliament asked, I'd just like to note that we have perhaps alighted over a bit the language in the last G7 that focused on concern about debt traps and also concern about putting forward a infrastructure partnership that is more available to countries in the global south. So as a counter to some of what they have seen as Chinese investment that is actually designed to involve countries in something that they later find themselves unable to extract themselves from. So I would expect to see some of that in this as well. I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thank you. I have a question from Walter Sim with the Straits Times of Singapore. And this is really a question for you, Rob. He asks, Japan is trying to promote this world without nuclear weapons, but since Japan itself is protected under a nuclear umbrella with the US-Japan alliance, it has not signed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Is this ironic? Is this an idealistic approach by Japan?
Well, I would defer to you, Shihoko, on reading the Japanese debate, which has kind of historical. There's a historical residue with respect to the nuclear issue. The main point I would make is that a primary tool of U.S. national security policy is extended deterrence, clear commitments to Japan, South Korea. This has created this reassurance, creates a context within which they will defer acquiring nuclear weapons and rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So the U.S. messaging needs to be clear. In the recent meeting with the South Korean president, an administration official referred to both the software and the hardware of the relationship. And the hardware, that aspect of it is one that is being assessed, given that in the 1990s, the United States withdrew theater nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula. The software piece is addressed through bilateral, and I note that there will be a trilateral consultation, U.S., Japan, South Korea, on the margins of the G7 meeting. But the emphasis is on extended deterrence and maintaining the credibility of it to reassure U.S. allies.
So on reassurance, let me turn to the topic of economic coercion once again. I would argue that the best thing that is desirable is to stop China from taking coercive actions in the first place, and that there is a movement towards having some kind of collective economic security. And Mark Kennedy, the director of the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center, asks, how is talk by Liz Truss and others of an economic NATO viewed in Europe and the global South? And I would also ask you, Robert, would this act as a deterrence? for China to take, to weaponize its economic position in the first place, if there is such a collective economic defense mechanism.
Who do you want to take that first, Shihoko? There's a Europe-focused part of that question and then a China part.
Let's turn to you, Robert, and say, will this stop China? Will this have a strike fear in the hearts of China to reconsider its economic statecraft?
I think it will strike annoyance in the heart of China, not so much fear. There's still considerable, despite China's economic slowdown, which is a long-term policy challenge for China. I think there's still considerable confidence there that its market, that its status as the world's leading trading nation and lending nation, as the economic lodestone, of Asia and perhaps even Eurasia, they think that that's going to work for them over time. So I say annoyance, not fear. Whether that coercion could really hold, given how dependent many countries are in various ways on China, is a major question. And so, as I say, it's going to be annoyance. Also, remember that from China's point of view, what we call economic coercion, China sees as a defensive reaction to attacks on its interests. In almost every case, even with Lithuania, when it renamed an office as a Taiwan representative office. For China, that's an attack on its sovereignty. When it started to coerce South Korea, when it installed the American THAAD system, they saw that as an attack on their security. So from China's point of view, this is all defensive. And the narrative here is one of an American-led, unjustified, incorrect attack on China. And so because they see these as defensive measures, I think you can expect China to continue to take them.
All right, so we have 3 minutes left. I'd like to take this opportunity to turn back to all of our speakers and ask, what will constitute success for your the country that you are focused on? What kind of movement forward would they expect, which will be well received back in their own capitals? Let me first turn to you, Phil.
Thanks, Shihoko. I think certainly for Italy, they're playing in this role, their membership in the G7, the fact that they are showing the might of Italy's economy, their enhanced role within the European Union, particularly since Brexit with the UK outside the European Union. The United States has reflected that in our own diplomacy and engagement, and the role Italy has played on energy diversification, the need to address migration and the issues in the global south will be key. I think Meloni will be pleased just to see the unity, the support for Ukraine, which will be primary, and addressing in a sensible, again, unified way at the G7 level the questions surrounding China. Same for the EU, a unified statement showing continuity of the EU and the whole G7 in supporting each other and Ukraine in particular.
Bill.
Yes, I think one thing to look out for is, in terms of responding to calls for more help from the global south, is what is done in terms of Africa. We have all these reports about the Wagner Group expanding its reach now into South Sudan, from Mali and other places, Libya in Africa. China, of course, has been well implanted there with its Belt and Road Initiative. And Emmanuel Macron, who recently pulled out his troops from the Sahel region, is calling for a new Western policy toward Africa. He points out that by the end of later this century, 1 in 3 human beings, given current demographic trends, will be African. And we need to prepare for a huge tsunami of immigrants coming across the Mediterranean because of the impact of climate change, drought, and civil war. I mean, he points out in one of my conversations with him, Lake Chad, 50 million people get their daily sustenance from Lake Chad. That is drying out. It'll be completely dry within 15 years. And those people will have to move. And they're going to want to move north across the Mediterranean. So these are longer term potential catastrophes that should be addressed in a forum like the G7.
Robin?
So I'll take this sort of for Germany and say, but success would be continued unity on Ukraine and some recognition of how far Germany has come over the course of the year. And I also think that they would look for no visible divisions on China policy and a kind of an affirmation of de-risking as the way going forward. And I'll leave it there because I know we have almost no minutes left.
No, I'm afraid we don't, but really, this has been such a rich discussion, and I know that there were a number of questions that I did not turn to. Thank you all so much for logging in, joining us today. Thank you, Bill, Robin, Phil, Robert, for being here, and also I would like to thank my colleagues in the AV division, Treon Burgess and team. And also my colleagues, Mary Ratliff and Joshua Spooner in particular, for making this happen. Thank you again. So it's happening this weekend. We will keep our eyes peeled on the proceedings. So until we come together again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.